It's my pleasure today not only to introduce Dr. James Duffy as our Grand Round speaker, but also to welcome him to our department in anticipation of an impending approval of an affiliate faculty position. Dr. Duffy currently is working as the Chief of Integrative Medicine at Sierra Tucson. He is a former professor of psychiatry at the University of Texas at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. He also served as adjunct professor of psychiatry at the Baylor College of Medicine. He has extensive clinical experience in consultation liaison psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, and also palliative medicine. He is a fellow of the American Neuropsychiatric Association and the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. He has built several highly successful clinical academic programs, and he is board certified in adult psychiatry, psychosomatic medicine, palliative medicine, and also holistic medicine. He has received several research grants, including a Robert Wood Johnson grant, and has published widely in the areas of neuropsychiatry, palliative medicine, ethics, and medical humanities. As an educator, he has been honored with teaching awards and has presented at national and international meetings. He has initiated several fellowships and has maintained a very active role in medical education in all areas throughout his career. He has been actively involved in supporting community-focused approaches to health care, most particularly in end-of-life care and dementia. This afternoon, Dr. Duffy will be discussing mind as medicine, contemplative neuroscience, and its implications for an integrative pathophysiology. And before he comes to the podium, let me let all of you know that he could not transfer his presentation from the his Apple laptop to our PCs. So if any of you would like handouts or a copy of his slides, just put your email address on the evaluation form and we'll get it to you. And also let me add that Dr. Duffy has nothing to disclose that would represent a conflict of interest in his presentation today.
Unfortunately. Thank you. Thanks, John, and thank you for inviting me to chat with you this afternoon. I was here in this auditorium about 18 months ago as part of the program of integrative medicine, talking on science of compassion, and it was really remarkable to me how many people watch your iTunes or your YouTube lectures here. I can't tell you how many emails I got from around the world from people who actually are watching these presentations. So I would suggest that if you want to be seen by a lot of people around the world, come and sign up near the front. I also just want to give an excuse that if my presentation is a little haphazard today, it's because I actually had kin on with something called psoas compartment syndrome a couple of weeks ago, which I didn't even know about until I got it, but actually was hospitalized here last week, and so I had actually intended to do the final tuning on this presentation last week and this week, but that's my excuse if it seems a little bit overwhelming at times or disorganized. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff in a short time. I'm not going to focus on details, but rather larger principles. And my challenge to you today, hopefully, is to get you to begin to ask yourself some new questions about the work that we're doing. I start with this slide. This is called a medical tanka. This is a sacred painting by a Tibetan monk. And this is a Tibetan medicine Buddha tanka, the blue medicine Buddha, sitting at the center of this mandala. I'm surrounded by his arhats, his enlightened teachers, his physicians, his different herbs and medications that he uses to treat his patients. The slide is there to remind us that as long as we are ignorant, we are diseased. And the ultimate goal of all healing is to find clarity of purpose and vision. Let's see if this goes forward. I also have to make a disclaimer that I like to walk around normally, and they tell me I'm not allowed to leave the podium because of the way that the things are filmed. So if I start walking away from the podium, please direct me back. Otherwise, I'll disappear off the screen. I wanted to just share this slide with you very quickly to start with, really as a disclaimer statement. There's a trend out there right now to say anything that's natural or integrative rather, and what comes in nice packaging can't be bad for you. And the more you can get of it, the better. This is a paper that came out last year looking at the effect of vitamin C supplementation and vitamin E supplementation in young men who are doing physical exercise. And in brief, what the study showed, in fact, was that if you do exercise 30 minutes every day or so and take vitamin C and vitamin E supplements at relatively small doses, you actually will block the beneficial effects on oxidative metabolism that you would get without taking those vitamins. And there's more and more data to suggest, in fact, that some of the things that we think as being harmless actually can be quite dangerous. And meditation itself is an extremely powerful and potentially quite hazardous technology if it's not used appropriately. I like to show this slide. This is, of course, Carl Jung. Some of us remember Carl Jung. He once said about his colleague Sigmund that Sigmund Freud was sitting on a whale while fishing for minnows. That Freud's interest in the unconscious and dreams was really missing the point, that the larger matter at hand was to understand the nature of consciousness itself, and that extended beyond simple upbringing and developmental stages, but actually into the nature of life itself. And I think that I show you this slide because I think this kind of sums up my entire talk today. This is a cartoon that says, Stanley was deeply disappointed when high in the Tibetan mountains he finally found his true self. Einstein once said, as I'll repeat in a few moments, that he wants to know God's thoughts and everything else is just details. Our society has become preoccupied with understanding details, not the bigger picture. What I hope to be able to do today is to bring you back to a place to understanding that real health and healing is not to be found in the details of modern science, but in understanding the natural nature of what it is to be alive and to be flourishing and to be resilient. So, here are two gentlemen at a podium. You'll recognize at least one of them as the Dalai Lama, and the other gentleman is Steve Kosselin, who's chairman of psychology at Harvard University. These two are chatting at a conference at MIT about 7 years ago. It was on the neuroscience of attention, a dialogue between Buddhism and neuroscientists. And Dr. Kosselin is showing His Holiness a picture of, as you can see up here, I guess I need to use you see the picture of the rabbit? Everybody see the rabbit? Well, actually, when you show that picture to people, all of us will either see a rabbit or we'll see something else, which is a duck, right? Some of us see a duck and some of us see a rabbit. None of us see both a rabbit and a duck at the same time. However, when he showed this picture to the Dalai Lama responded, he said to him, what do you see, Your Holiness? His Holiness said, I see a rabbit and a duck. Interesting. And we're going to come back to why it is that he was able to hold both of those constructs simultaneously in his consciousness at the same time. I also show this slide because I want us to, one of the really important things that we need to always do is to understand why we are where we are, why are we here today. I do a lot of work with physicians and clinicians around renewal and burnout. And have just started actually a 1-week retreat program at Esalen, where I work with a friend of mine, around trying to help physicians and nurses and psychologists rediscover the meaning in their work. And one of the things that always comes up is, how do we take this great feeling that we have at Esalen and the cliffs and Big Sur and the wonderful food and the hugging and everything else and the kumbaya back to the medical center? How do you bring Big Sur back to the University of Arizona Medical Center? So we've developed a thing we call the yoga of medicine, which is a whole different conversation. But the beginning of that is by understanding that the first step in everything that we do, if we're to find meaning, is to understand our intention for why we're doing it. Why are we doing what are we doing? Why did you bother to come to this auditorium this afternoon? Maybe you were forced to come because it needs to be part of your supervision, your evaluation. Maybe you have an interest in the topic. Maybe you were bored Maybe you're motivated by a desire to be compassionate and understand the suffering of the people that you've come to serve here at your hospital. Creating right intention needs to be the beginning of everything that we do. And I ask you to think about that as you think about this talk and as you go about your work as clinicians. So here's a slide that actually I came across on the airplane on this weekend, just coming back from I was talking at a conference on Buddhism and psychology in San Diego. And this was Scientific America this week, actually. And it's a slide, it's fairly self-explanatory. What it shows in the different colored dots is the increase in the incidence of obesity between 1980 and 2008. The blue dots are people whose body mass index is above 30%. The green dots are people between 25 and 30, and the rest, the smaller dots, are below 25. And what you see there is just an absolute explosion of obesity in our country. And on the other side of the slide, you see the increase in conditions such as coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, and death rates. The death rate among males and females has tripled if you're obese in the last 30 years. Something profoundly wrong is happening to the health of the United States and the Western world, despite the fact that we're spending $147 billion a year on trying to cure obesity and treat it. So the question is, what's going on? Well, a number of years ago I was, and I think you're picking up, I have a little bit of a bias towards Buddhism and Buddhist perspectives. A number of years ago I was in Dharamsala at a teaching by the Dalai Lama in India. It was a one-week teaching, and he would give a teaching for 3 or 4 hours, and he'd take questions. And somebody in the audience asked him a question. They said, "Your Holiness, we hear that in the old days, people would live to be 130 years old. How is that possible? In the days of Shangri-La, people lived to be 130, and they were healthy and fit, and then they died." And His Holiness said, well, he wasn't around in the days of Shangri-La, but he understands that it is true, that it is possible and natural for human beings to live to be 120, 130, and not to have to be chronically diseased, and to have happy, healthy lives. One of my interests is in medical acupuncture and 5-element acupuncture, and here's a quotation from the Yellow Emperor's Neijing textbook of medicine. He said 2,000 years ago, "I've heard that in ancient times the people lived to be over 100 years of age, yet they remained active and did not become decrepit in their activities. But nowadays," he says, "it seems that people reach only half that age and yet become decrepit and failing." And so I think most of us would agree that the modern medicine today is not about maintaining flourishing and human excellence, but more about patchwork and dealing with decrepity. And no matter how much money we spend, no matter how much of our GNP we attribute to healthcare and even preventative medicine, it seems the numbers keep getting worse. And so the question is, now what? What do we do? Do we just basically keep... I heard a figure once. I used to talk about palliative medicine a lot, and I used to quote this figure from an economist that if we kept growing healthcare at the rate that we are now, the entire gross national product will be spent on healthcare within 65 years. Everything that we do in this country within 100 years will be either spent preventing or treating disease. Can we keep doing this? I would suggest that we have reached what you might call the midlife crisis of modern scientific medicine. This is a picture of Dante's Inferno. Here's Dante in the middle of his life. He reaches a dark space in the woods where the way is not truly known. And what is he going to do next? So what I would like to suggest in the next 40 minutes or so is let's get back to basics. Let's begin to question our very assumptions about what we're doing and begin to look at some of the scientific data that's out there right now that's beginning to challenge us to begin to really reformulate our view of the world. And so here's a fun little slide that I always love showing to audiences because it's kind of neat. I want you to have a look. Everybody can see that slide. I want everybody to tell me when you can see the lady's face on the slide. Just put your hand up. Anybody not see the face? Can you see the face? Everybody see the face? All right. No, I want you to tell me when you can see Bill Clinton playing the saxophone. All right? Everybody see Bill playing the saxophone? Let's go back and see the lady's face. Okay, everybody see the lady's face? Everybody now look for Bill Clinton. Do you see him? See the lady's face? All right. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to make out when you recognize the face out of this picture. And I want you to just put your hand up when you recognize the face. We have one hand. You guys are taking longer than the last one. Put your hand up when you make out the face. Okay, the reason the face is there, I can promise you. The face is, and I can't use the pointer, unfortunately, but I'm going to just move from the podium. Face is right now. Yeah? Right? So what just happened there? Did I do some kind of sleight of hand? No, what I did was I basically formed your perspective of the world and entrained you through an engram to have an expectation about what you would see next. And you failed to see what was right in front of your face, which was a man's face in the coffee beans. So, let's get back to basics. You know, most of the time when we have grand rounds, it's all about giving people answers, right? I think, you know, one of the most pathetic things is to ask a medical student a question and they haven't got an answer. Residents always have answers. Medical students is like they get terrified and they'll say whatever. I mean, you know, you'll say, what color is the sky? And if they haven't got the answer, they'll say purple. Because in our educational system, what makes you valuable is not what you ask, but what you know. And for some reason, we've come to believe that if you haven't got the answer, if you only have questions, then there must be something wrong with you. I would like to suggest that what's most important is not our questions, not our answers, but our questions. And this is a picture of Sam Keen, who is a theologian, philosopher, a wonderful guy who lives on the West Coast near Mendocino. And Sam has written some wonderful books, Fire in the Belly, and some other books which I really recommend. But one of the things Sam does is he actually teaches trapeze. Sam's not a young man anymore. And I did the trapeze training course with Sam, and he uses it as a metaphor for life. Like, why the hell are you standing on this bar 30 feet up, and why the hell would you let go of the pole and believe that I'm going to catch you? So Sam really says that what defines us as human beings is not the answers we derive, but the questions that we ask ourselves. So what I would like to suggest is that it's time to start asking smarter questions. This actually is an advertisement from IBM that I came across in the New York Times this weekend. IBM's business consulting. The big thing now is, you know, it's not about, you know, us solving things, it's about you asking smarter questions. And so, what is the question? What is the big question? Well, I've had a pretty crazy professional life on paper. Some people get it, some people don't. I was born in England, I grew up in the Middle East and Africa. I had a shaman living in my backyard. I went to medical school in Southern Africa and did internal medicine residency, a couple of years of radiology, went into psychiatry, then did behavioral neurology for a few years. Dr. Jeff Ahern, who I know works here, was my co-fellow. Then ended up doing neuropsychiatry and then palliative care, then integrative medicine and acupuncture, and you can say this guy's really, really confused. Right? But really, as I look back, it kind of makes sense to me now. Just because the big question I was asking myself is really, what is healing all about? I mean, what are we actually doing? You know, what is healing? You know, when medical students, I worked a lot with medical students over the years, and in the last few years at MD Anderson would have 4 new students with me every month. And I would start off by asking them, what are they doing here? And they say, well, we're here to become doctors. And I'd say, well, what does it mean to be a doctor? And they'd say, well, to practice medicine. And I'd say, well, so what is medicine? And they say, well, medicine is, you don't know what medicine is? I said, no, I'm asking you what medicine is. And they say, well, medicine makes people better. I said, well, so how long are you going to train for? About 15 years. And I said, so what is the philosophy of this cult that you're joining for 15 years and giving up your youth and your free time and your health and perhaps the rest of your life, what is the philosophical underpinning of this? And they'd say, well, to help people. And I'd say, well, you know, that's kind of vague. I mean, what have your professors told you about the principles of your medicine? And maybe 1 out of 20 medical students, pretty smart medical students, could actually tell me that they were practicing allopathic medicine. So then they'd say, okay, that's great, so you're practicing allopathic medicine. What does allo mean? We have some medical students came in. Were those the medical students that came in a little later? Can you guys tell me what allopathic medicine, the definition is? No, it's kind of... But then you guys are practicing allopathic medicine. It's not the only kind of medicine. There's homeopathic medicine, osteopathic medicine, there's Chinese medicine, there's Ayurvedic medicine, homeopathic medicine, it goes on and on and on. Allopathic medicine means treating pathology, pathos, suffering, with opposite. We are the opposite doctors. If you have hypertension, we'll give you an antihypertensive. If you have an infection, we'll give you an antibiotic. If you're depressed, we'll give you an antidepressant. Nothing wrong with that. The trouble is that it seems to be hitting a brick wall, because as I showed you just now, all the numbers are beginning to suggest that it ain't working anymore. We've reached a kind of economic, philosophical midlife crisis. And so this is where I work now for the last 3 months. This is Sierra Tucson. Here's a field where every year we have the alumni come back, and they actually spend a few days at nearby hotels, and they spend time in programs getting to rejuvenate themselves, and they have this big circle every year, which is pretty amazing. And this is the view from my office on the right there. So life has changed a lot for me, but because the question that I'm challenging it now is, okay, so what is healing, and what could a place like Sierra Tucson, which is so different than MD Anderson or the Methodist Hospital, where I worked before that, or Beth Israel, possibly have to do with the nature of healing, and what can we learn from that? What I would like to suggest today is that we need to move back to what I call the inner tradition of healing, which is a whole separate talk and conversation in itself. What I would like to suggest today is that we're about to engage upon what I would call the next great technological revolution of mankind. Boy, that's a pretty big statement, isn't it? What I would like to suggest is that, just like the discovery of fire and the wheel and the industrial process and nuclear energy, the discovery of the mind and its ability to heal and form consciousness will be the next evolutionary step forward in our capacity not just to be healthier human beings, but actually have a planet that's survivable. So let me begin that conversation. Here's a picture of 2 people. William James, professor of psychology, Harvard. Many of us, of course, know about him. He wrote his wonderful textbook on the varieties of religious experience. He actually was very, very interested in psychology of attention and did some wonderful writing on attention. 1894, Swami Vivekananda came from India to the World Council of Religions meeting in Chicago. He was the first Eastern religious leader to actually speak at the parliament. And he blew everybody away with this whole radical concept of contemplation, meditation, and the capacity for ourselves to transform ourselves through these practices. So a few years later, James invited this gentleman, Dharampala Anagarika, who was a Sri Lankan monk, to come and give a grand rounds lecture at Harvard on the nature of meditation and consciousness. Pretty daring stuff, right? Everybody was so impressed, and William James was so impressed, he jumped up at the end of the presentation and said, "This stuff is amazing." He said, "In 25 years," he said, "this is going to be the psychology that will drive the future of psychology and psychiatry and medicine itself." That was in 1904. I think James was right. He was just about 100 years out of date. And in the last 3 decades, we've suddenly seen a conversation arising in the West about these Eastern technologies, whereas in the West we have been studying the outside world through scientific objectivity. In the East, that the scientists have been studying the inside world of the subjective and the contemplative. So, of course, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and the Beatles fly in a helicopter into Esalen. People begin to talk about this new kind of thing called transcendental meditation. Ram Dass gets kicked out of Harvard, Richard Alport for daring to suggest that there are forms of consciousness that extend beyond the American point of view, or rather the Harvard point of view. We see conversations now opening up between scholars of religion, the inner scientists of the East, particularly the Tibetans, and Western scientists. If any of you don't know about Mind and Life Institute, I really recommend you go on that website, Mind and Life. They're now, I think, into their 20th dialogue. I think Dr. Raisin may have mentioned that when he talked here a couple of weeks ago, but actually this week they are having a conversation between the Dalai Lama and others on neuroscience and I think compassion. Meditation is on the front page of Time magazine. Not only that, they talk about the science of meditation. Can you imagine? And on Archives of General Psychiatry last March, and all of us as psychiatrists know, when it comes to biological psychiatry and reductionist concepts, it doesn't get much harder these days than the Archives of General Psychiatry. Here is a picture of the wrathful deity Mahakala of the Tibetan dynasty on the front page of the Archives of General Psychiatry. Something really remarkable is going on. And so everybody gets really excited, and we say we have this new thing called meditation, and the Beatles are doing it, and Maharishi's doing it, and it's in Time magazine, and everybody should do this, and you're all going to get better and be happy. And so in November 2007, a study was released. It was a foundations-funded meta-analysis of all the data out there on the medical or health benefits or effects, rather, of meditation practice out of a group in, I think, Edmonton, Alberta. You could go onto the NCAM website. It's about 470 pages long, this meta-analysis. This was to be the final word as to whether meditation was actually good for you or not. And here's what they concluded. The field of research on meditation practices and their therapeutic applications is beset with uncertainty. Firm conclusions on the effects of meditation practices in healthcare cannot be drawn based upon the available evidence. Let me just add in parenthesis, it'll probably lower your cholesterol a little bit and lower your blood pressure a little bit. So that's it, game over, right? We did the evidence-based model. We applied the Cochrane-based criteria, and that's all we get out of the story. We're all kidding ourselves. I would suggest that maybe we just need to ask the different question, as I mentioned. The first thing that we need to understand, and I'm not going to spend any time on this because we haven't got the time to do it, but is that trying to do research on meditation in medical populations is almost impossible. That, you know, you can't produce a methodology for me looking at the effect of meditation in any medical population or even any community population that I can't tear to shreds based on these limitations that I have here. Okay? What I would like to suggest is we need to go back to a basic concept, which is, what is meditation actually all about? Right? It's kind of like saying, oh, you know, Novartis produces a pill one day, right? And they say, listen, we want you to give this pill to everybody and let's see if it helps them. And you say, well, who should we give it to? You say, don't worry about that. It's good for everybody. We wouldn't buy that one, right? So why would we buy that approach with meditation? What we need to begin with is an understanding that meditation essentially is the technology of attention. Meditation is the technology of attention. Now, as a neuropsychiatrist, you know, I understand that attention is the beginning and the end of everything our brain does. There's lower order attention, higher order attention. It involves basically all levels of the neuroaxis. When I examine my patients as a neuropsychiatrist, I will spend most of my time examining their attentional system. My mentor at Beth Israel, my fellowship, along with Dr. Ahern, was Dr. Meslin, who was the world's expert on attentional systems. And I think Dr. Meslin would agree with this definition of attention. What is attention? Attention is like when you're examining a tapestry in a dark room. If you illuminate that tapestry with a very steady flashlight, you can vividly examine the images in the tapestry. But if your flashlight is dim, or although it's bright, it kind of flickers in the wind, then your observation of the tapestry will be impaired. Likewise, when analyzing the nature of any phenomena supporting penetrating intelligence with unwavering, sustained, voluntary attention, and you can clearly observe the real nature of the phenomena under investigation. Now, that's quite a mouthful, but I can tell you that as a neuroscientist, I can't find any fault with that definition of attention. This was published in a very prestigious journal, Lamrim Chenro, in the 14th century by Tsongkhapa, Jacob Tsongkhapa. These guys knew what they were doing. Meditation, contemplative practices are the technology of understanding consciousness and attention. Here's a quotation that came out in April of this year out of a group from Skidmore College looking at the effects of meditation. I'm going to let you just read that. It's basically entirely consistent with what J. Tsongkhapa said 600 years ago, that if you practice meditation according to their studies with individuals, you will become more efficient and more flexible in your attentional processes. Isn't that amazing? We're 600 years later and we're just catching up with the definitional issues that were described so long ago. This is not about, people living in caves. It's not about, the Dalai Lama. It's not about Hindu ashrams or Swamijis. This is about every single society on this planet has had technologies of contemplation or meditation. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but probably the one group that has lost its technology is the monotheistic Western religions, at least the ones that may be mostly Western-oriented. The more Eastern-oriented Orthodox religions have maintained a very strong contemplative practice, and they're beginning to make their way back into mainstream Christian teachings. And of course today we have Father Thomas Keating and Lawrence Freeman, who are doing some really interesting work with centering prayer and contemplative prayer, which is now being taught in churches all over the world, and really is a form of just meditation. What's coming next? So, what I would like to suggest is that the basic problem with the West, the basic problem with our world, with the Western consciousness virus that we have created that has taken over our planet, is that we have an epidemic of an attention deficit disorder. Right? Time magazine again. Attention deficit disorder. Are you disorganized, distracted, discombobulated? Doctors say you may have attention deficit disorder. I have never seen so many people on psychostimulants as I've seen in the last couple of years. It seems like it's almost just the rite of passage to be on Adderall. Everybody is complaining about not being able to pay attention. I'd recommend this book by Maggie Jackson called Distracted. She talks about the erosion of attention and the coming of the dark age. That as our attentional systems begin to fail, a lot of things are starting to happen to our societies and our planet as a consequence of that. So what I'm going to suggest is that we can actually begin to understand illness, human suffering, in context of attention, as an attentional disorder. Now, this is not my suggestion. This was a suggestion that I came across in a book by John Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction. A wonderful book called Coming to Our Senses. John, in just 2 lines, said it seemed to him fairly obvious that all suffering and all illness was a consequence of a disorder of paying attention. That when we fail to pay attention, we move from harmony to disharmony. And if we fail to pay attention for long enough, or if our attention continues to be distracted, then our harmonious system moves into a static state of disharmony. And if it remains disharmonious long enough, and if the degree of change is serious enough, it becomes a dysregulation. And if that dysregulation is serious enough, it becomes fixed in a physical state, which we in allopathic medicine would call a disease. And if your organ is diseased enough, your cirrhosis is bad enough, or your ejection fraction is small enough, you will die or disintegrate. What's really interesting is in the last few years we've actually begun to develop a language within physiology that is entirely consistent with this contemplative model of illness and suffering. And once again, I'm going to turn to my medical students who are trying to avoid my gaze. But you guys have all heard about homeostasis, right? How many of you had much talk about lectures on allostasis? Not much. None at all, maybe. Allostatic load. Hormesis. Right? Karen knows about these words. This is the new language of healthcare that's beginning to emerge that has particular relevance for all diseases and most specifically, I think, for mental illness. So what I would suggest, actually, for using an attentional model or contemplative model of health and illness is that harmony really equates to homeostasis or hemodynamic stasis, all right? And the more resilience you have, the larger your capacity to maintain homeostatic range despite being challenged by insults. And one of your faculty, Mark Gilbert, and I gave a wonderful talk here last year and actually wrote a chapter for us. We have a textbook of psycho-oncology coming out in December, and Mark wrote a wonderful chapter on resiliency. And really, at its basis, resiliency is the capacity to create a more and more ability to respond to insults, whether they be infections or physical stressors, emotional stressors, but keep the balance, not get out of harmony. When we are challenged by something that can't be contained within our homeostatic response, then we have what's called an allostatic response. So this would be, for example, being subjected to a bacterium that we're genetically susceptible to. We can't contain it within our system, so we develop an inflammatory response to that through cytokines and other mechanisms that you medical students know more about than I do. If that dysregulation, that disharmony is severe enough, let's say I'm eating McDonald's every day on my way to work, and on my way home from work I also pick up a cup of McDonald's, you know, I can do that for a few years maybe, right? I can, you know, my body will say, okay, well, we'll just increase our insulin production and we'll keep us around 100, 120 and our hemoglobin A1C will be within range. It'll be okay, but, you know, after about 5 or 6 years, oh man, you know, this resiliency of the system just wears down, and then it says, you know, we just can't do this anymore. We're gonna decide that what's normal now is a blood sugar of 180. And then we have what we call an allostatic load. We've changed our set point of what's normal. The trouble is that that set point has physical consequences for the organ that's involved in the system that's regulating it. And when that's there long enough, then we develop pancreatic depletion, islet cell depletion syndrome, we get diabetes. You know, Darwin didn't really talk about the survival of the fittest. What he actually said, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, but rather the one that is most responsive to change. The capacity to maintain ourselves within that circle of homeostasis and harmony is really what determines our ability to be flourishing as a species. Now, this word hormesis I've thrown in there. Many of you have, many people come across the word hormesis? So really, hormesis, let me just go forward a couple of slides. Hormesis was actually discovered by mistake, really, after the nuclear bombs were dropped on the Japanese at the end of the Second World War. Of course, many people died immediately from the effect of the atomic bomb. Many people developed cancer years later. What was surprising to epidemiologists is when they went back, is they found actually there people that were beyond a certain distance, but within a certain distance from the epicenter of the bomb, actually had decreased incidences of cancer. What this began to suggest then was that was a little bit of radiation, increased radiation, actually was pretty good for you, right? And so now this concept of hormesis has begun to develop. The idea being that if you can expose yourself like those young people I talked about at the beginning of my presentation who exercise, going for a 30-minute walk is really a hormetic exercise. What it does is it stresses your system, allows it to develop more responsive, resilient capacity to deal with oxidative stress, right? And so hormesis is also one of those words that you're going to be hearing a lot more about in the future. What's also interesting is that the allostatic load story is becoming really central in the conversation around mental health and physical health, and Elizabeth Appel's work at UCSF really beginning to look at, you know, what are the consequences of growing up in a family where there's stress, where there's constant disharmony. The data is very clear. You know, you have psychosocial stressors that produce a chronic allostatic load, and it will eventually make you physically ill. And so all of these pieces are beginning to come together in a very exciting way. The goal then, as human beings, is for us to be able to maintain harmony in our lives. And I'm going to share this quotation with you from a wonderful Chinese medicine teacher, Lonnie Jarrett. Wrote a book called Nourishing Destiny, and I think he really describes this whole idea about what it means to be in harmony and balance with yourself and the universe. He says the fulfillment of our destiny entails being able to acknowledge the nature of the seed of heaven that has been planted, a seed synonymous with our deep nature and our inborn constitution. Our contract with heaven is broken the moment we start closing doors to self-expression and obstructing the flow of qi between heaven and earth. And like a great flood, the Tao will overwhelm any obstacle, and symptoms will appear within the inner kingdom of the body. These symptoms appear as obstructions and rivers of the physical body, the mind, and the spirit. I mean, isn't that a wonderful kind of synopsis of what I just said? When you are in harmony, energy flows without obstruction. You're able to maintain balance. You learn from experience. You become more resilient. And here, just real quickly, is a picture of acupuncture meridians. It's really all just about maintaining balance. When I use my needles, acupressure, when I do 5-element psychotherapy, I'm trying to keep these channels open that allow the flow of energy to stop things getting stuck in creating an allostatic response or allostatic load. I love this picture from Leonardo. Of course, this is the famous Petruvian man. Really, the message here is that man, even in Leonardo's time, was recognized to come out of right relationship with nature, right? The circle is moved outside the box within which man is staying, and of course Homer Simpson is doing an even better job of getting out of balance through his Duff beer and his hamburgers. So we've talked about these things. You medical students know this back to front, the slide. Okay, this is that allostatic response. This is the inflammation part of the cycle that leads eventually to disease. So, here's the cycle that I'm talking about, an attentional model of pathophysiology. That in the ideal state, we live in a world of homeostasis. When we are challenged by something, we have a hormetic learning response that creates increased resilience and moves us back from allostasis back into homeostasis. However, if the challenge is long enough, too many hamburgers, too many ice creams, too many Coca-Colas for too long, too many beers, our body changes its regulatory set point, becomes a fixed allostatic load that, depending on your genotype and your epigenotype, which is probably even more important, you will manifest a disease. Right? So, what could meditation have to do with all of this? What I'd like to be able to show you in the next few minutes is that the data shows us, I think, quite clearly that meditation will affect allostatic response, will affect allostatic load, affects epigenetic responsiveness or expressivity, and can lead to reductions eventually in the emergence of disease patterns. I show this slide from Ken Wilber. Some of you may know his integral model. I show this slide to just say that this is not just about the human body. This is about the human body. It's about our relationship with each other, you and I, our relationship with other species, our relationship with the planet, our relationship with the universe. That harmony to dysregulation affects not just the physical form, but mind, body, and spirit. Biopsychosocial, spiritual, right? You've heard about this. You guys may know this slide that is the modern day equivalent of this. This is Nico Christakis' work from the Framingham Heart Study that was published about 18 months ago. He wrote a wonderful book last year called Connected. What Dr. Christakis showed, and he actually is a palliative care physician, is that you need to be real careful about not only who's living next door to you or who your friend is, but who their friend is and who their friend is and who their friend is. Is that we are all connected. That when one of us gets out of balance, it has a downstream effect. What his data shows, for example, is if your neighbor happens to be depressed, you are more likely to be depressed. If your neighbor's friend is depressed, even if your neighbor is not depressed, you are more likely to be depressed. If your neighbor's friend's friend is depressed, you're more likely to be depressed. You can go onto his website, it's on here. Dr. Christakis. He has a wonderful animation there. I mean, everything is connected to everything else, right? Nothing is in isolation. So, Dr. Raisin may have talked about this, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. Inflammation is the big killer. One of the most amazing things I learned at MD Anderson was about inflammation. We had some really amazing scientists working around the cause of cancer, but what we learned most of all was that ultimately everything is about inflammation, even depression. When I started working at MD Anderson as a psychiatrist, there's few things more daunting than thinking about being a psycho-oncologist. It's like, you mean you want to spend your day talking to people that have cancer? It's like, what are you going to talk about, and they're depressed, and your job as a psychiatrist is to tell them not to be depressed, and they have stage 4 pancreatic cancer, right, and they get chemotherapy and they're in pain. And I was like, well, gee, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to help anybody. I have never had so many patients respond so quickly to antidepressants as the patients I treated who had cancer who were depressed. And that is because, as Dr. Raisin shared with you as presentation, I'm sure, there are models now using interferon and other models that, in fact, depression, at least some forms of depression, are inflammatory responses. Everything is inflammatory, right? And this shows you the higher the cytokine level, right, the greater the degree of damage to the system. What I would suggest is the higher the cytokine level, the more dysregulated your attentional system is, the more out of balance you are, moving from harmony to disharmony to dysregulation. One of my patients from MD Anderson, just to remind once again that people with cancer suffer from tremendous physical and spiritual suffering. Much of it is caused by our treatment. But the remarkable thing is that they're becoming models for understanding the nature of inflammation itself and its pathways. And I show this slide completely out of sequence because I just feel that it's just so remarkable. This is a slide from a friend of mine, Bharat Agarwal. Bharat was the discoverer of TNF-alpha. Some of you may have heard of TNF-alpha. Genentech's big entry point into the billion-dollar world. Bharat was a researcher at MD Anderson now. He is pretty much spending his full time working on curcumin, turmeric. He has incredible data. And if you look up his work, Bharat Agarwal, Aggarwal, he has really interesting data to suggest that curcumin is the universal anti-inflammatory. I would suggest that maybe meditation is as well. And here's a slide showing that evidence-based to support efficacy of curcumin in all of these conditions. So I have an almost ethical responsibility to suggest that all of you take curcumin. It's curry powder, okay, turmeric, has no side effects, and it blocks NF-kappa beta. So back to meditation. William James, our friend, said 100 years ago, the faculty of bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. Any education which should improve this would be an education of par excellence. I was driving to work this morning and I was listening to NPR, and there was a person talking about what a terrible state public education is in the United States. We're just not educating people. William James suggested that if we go back to basics and understand that the ability to control one's attention is the foundation of wisdom, we can begin to educate our next generations. And here is a high school in Fairfield, Iowa. Has a really cool name. It's called the High School of the New Age of Enlightenment. Not a cool name? And this actually was started by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And actually, they're building a new medical school there. It's going to be an allopathic integrative medicine medical school. They actually have the money and the plans and everything. But anyway, these kids, meditation practice is part of their daily routine. They spend half an hour to an hour every day doing meditation. What's interesting, they're a small school. Every year they win the state debating championship. They win national debating championships. Their kids' SAT scores are vastly above the national average. And you know what? Occasionally they even win the state basketball championship. Not bad for a bunch of kids who look like that. So maybe William James was right. Now, I know that I'm running out of time. Very, very quickly. There are different kinds of meditation. This is a whole separate talk. There's concentrated meditation where we stabilize our perception of things, insight oriented meditation where we stabilize our conception of things, and then transformative meditation. What this basically means is that one form of meditation, which is called shamatha, is to focus on stabilizing the object. If I'm a student in a monastery in Tibet, I will spend the first couple of years debating as to what color is the white horse. Interesting, right? Is the horse white? Is white a color? What color? I mean, they can just take it on. Zen monks in Japan stare at a candle flame, right? The goal is to stabilize the object as it is without being interfered by extraneous things. The other kind of meditation is vipassana, which is the same as mindfulness, essentially. And this is about stabilizing the subjective response to the object, right? So one stabilizes the subject, one stabilizes the object. Between those two in our brains, there's about 100 milliseconds. I once heard a Hindu teacher tell me that God lives in the space between the in-breath and the out-breath. You know from your physiology there's a gap there, right? Take a deep breath in, and you're out. That's the physiological curve, right? There's something that happens in that 100 milliseconds, which is where the third kind of meditation, or cybernetic or transformative meditation happens, which we don't have time to talk about right now. So, I'm going to keep moving really quickly. I know I'm running out of time. This is Immanuel Kant. He said, the goal of philosophy is to understand, see things as they are, as themselves. The goal of attention is just to be able to see things as they are. Stable subject, stable object, right? Das Ding und Sicht, things as they are. This is the curriculum for a monk going through his studies in a monastery in Tibet. The 8 jhana levels of meditation. Each of them have very specific characteristics. The kindergarten stage of meditation in the East would be that you need to have the ability to stop wandering thoughts, be able to have the object as your primary dominating thought, and have brief, rapturous-like feelings. For most of us in the West, we would think we were in nirvana if we got to that point. I mean, you know, there's a science here, there's a technology that is profoundly sophisticated and available to us if we're willing to ask the right questions of it and of ourselves. So, is meditation just the same as relaxing? This is Herb Benson. This is his famous book, okay, the relaxation response. My answer is absolutely no, okay? This is somebody who's relaxing. This is heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is a measurement of autonomic stability, responsivity, resiliency. At Sierra Tucson, all of our patients go through neuro and biofeedback. It's remarkable how their patterns change when we do things like meditation, when they're no longer depressed. This person has a very high, this person's relaxing, right? Has a very high peak of what we call low frequency heart rate variability. When your beat-to-beat variation is exactly the same, when the time between one beat and the next beat is exactly the same, is one beat away from when you're going to be dead. All right? Beat-to-beat variability is a measure of wellness and resiliency that I was talking about earlier. Here's a monk meditating. Very different pattern, right? What he's doing here is he's not only increasing the blue range, he's also increasing that pale blue aquamarine range, which is the ultra-low frequency, which is a measurement of not just vagal but also sympathetic responsivity. This is a state of relaxed attentiveness. That seems like an oxymoron, right? How can you be relaxed and attentive? This is the guy in the Karate Kid or whatever, the teacher who's sitting there meditating and grabs the fly out of the sky, right? Because he's finely tuned. He's in that homeostatic equilibrium that allows him to continuously recalibrate his physiology and his attention to the demands of the state. Another example of this is a superstar. This is a Japanese Shinto monk showing a huge spike in his ultra-low frequency heart rate variability. I mean, this is an organism that is doing extremely well in its harmony. Study out of China. China, you're not allowed to talk about meditation because it's considered to be a religion and a meditation. And we heard about Falun Gong. So they're now publishing data under what they call integrative body-mind therapy. Isn't that interesting? So there's actually data coming out of China now on IBMT, which is actually like MBSR, but they can't call it that. What the study showed was that when you do these meditations, practices, it improves your autonomic tone, and it seems to be mediated, at least in this study, mostly through the anterior cingulate cortex. I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but the bottom line from these studies is that it seems as though the parasympathetic system is extremely important in our response to meditation and has profound effects on well-being that move beyond simple relaxation. And I would refer you to the work of Stephen Porges, Porges, and his triphasic model of the vagus. What he would suggest is that there is now a neovagal system that has developed in Homo sapiens that is responsible for creating safe space in which we have regulated facial expression, more emotional prosody, even our ability to hear and communicate with each other is better. We have decreased inflammation when we activate our neovagus through the NF-kappa beta, remember curcumin? And we could go on and on about this. The EMDR people believe that this is how EMDR works. It actually allows you to move into a neovagal state. It's really just the same as meditation. So the data on electrophysiology of meditation is extremely complicated and extremely boring and extremely aggravating. And I'm not going to spend any time because we're running out of time. I'm going to give you the synopsis. I went through the literature. This is the really interesting study. This is a study out of Oxford University from 2007. Up on the left side, you will see there's the dark bars, which represent pre, and the white bar, which is post. These are patients who had a history of very severe depressions. Average number of 6 suicide attempts among these patients. Pretty severe, right? And the control subjects and the subjects who did the 6 weeks of meditation but had EEGs done. And what you see here on this first slide is that both studies, when they were not depressed, both of these groups are not depressed at this point, have increased activation, or dominance rather, in their left prefrontal region. Now, when you put folks through 6 weeks of MBSR, what happened was the people who did the MBSR continued to activate their left frontal lobes. The ones that didn't switched over to right frontal activation. The other slide is similar, but it's a different series of loads. What this tells us is that when you do meditation, you maintain activity in your left prefrontal system, which I'll explain in a second is why it's very helpful. The most important research in meditation right now in terms of electrophysiology is in gamma wave synchrony. Gamma waves are going to become the next big thing for us as psychiatrists. Gamma waves are what happens when things fit. When I showed you those pictures earlier on about Bill Clinton playing the saxophone, the moment you recognize Bill Clinton, or the moment you recognize the lady's face, you actually generated interhemispheric and cross-hemispheric gamma wave synchrony and gamma wave power. Gamma waves represent 30 to 100 hertz wave activity. It wasn't something we even bothered to even measure until recently. What we've discovered is that when you have people do meditation, and here's the happiest man in the world called Mathieu Ricard. Seriously, he was voted the happiest man in the world by Time magazine. Mathieu is a French monk and an immunologist. Richie Davidson did studies with him and some other monks where they did compassion meditation, and they looked at the electrophysiological characteristics. What they found was when these individuals, these monks like Mathieu, meditated, they produced incredible gamma wave synchrony and gamma wave power. It was the highest that had ever been recorded. What the study shows on the controls is someone like me doing the compassion meditation, I hardly synchronize at all. But like any other skill, if you keep singing, you increase your power more and more. And what's interesting is that 2 conditions that we see in psychiatry are characterized by unstable gamma wave synchrony. That's borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia. Both conditions in which individuals lack the capacity for stable self-identity and self-awareness. So the argument would be that gamma wave activity is really a measurement of self-stability and self-referential stability in particular. I know I'm moving, I think I'm running out of time very quickly. So here is the synopsis of all of 100 studies of EEG work and meditation. Meditation results in an attentional state characterized by left frontal activation, cortical tuning, in which non-relevant cortical functions are inhibited, all right, while specific networks are enhanced, such as gamma synchronization. This state of relaxed attentiveness appears to be trainable, producing both state, in other words, it happens when you're meditating, but also trait in between, as I'll show you in a moment, changes in the individuals. I'm not going to show you the study other than say that this is the earliest study from Richie Davidson and John Kabat-Zinn showing that when people meditate, they increase their immune response to flu vaccine, ability to have an immune response. I'm sure Chuck Raisin shared this slide with you from Linda Carlson's work in Canada. I mean, this stuff is mind-blowing. Linda Carlson took some patients with breast cancer, prostate cancer, trained them in MBSR, and she took some measurements of inflammation and total well-being. She looked at salivary cortisol, IFN gamma, and quality of life in measurement. What she found is that at the end of 8 weeks or 6 weeks of training, the people who did the meditation training had lower levels of cortisol, had lower levels of inflammatory response, had a better quality of life. Gee, that's great. What's mind-blowing is she came back a year later and she looked at the same subjects and she found that, and this is what this shows here, is that, here we can do it, a year later the differences are even greater. And it didn't really seem to matter how much meditation you were doing. When you meditate, not only do you change yourself then, you possibly change yourself permanently in a more positive, harmonious direction. This is work from Linda Wittek-Januszek from Chicago, I believe. It basically says the same thing. When you do MBSR and you have cancer, your markers of inflammation go down, okay, IL-10, IL-4, IL-6, your serum cortisol levels go down, your quality of life goes up, your spiritual quality of life goes up, your family quality of life goes up. Really interesting data, which needs to be looked at some more. Now, how do we explain the fact that Linda Carlson's patients kept getting better? Maybe this is the answer. There's a study from Jeff Druzek, Herb Benson's Mind-Body Center at Mass General. This is what's called a heat map, gene expression heat map. What he showed was that when you take individuals and train them for 6 weeks in mindfulness meditation, you will change the expression of over 1,700 genes on a gene heat map. Can you imagine that? 1,700 genes will change their expression, and it seems that most of the genes involved in this change are involved with oxidative stress response. What was also interesting was that if you took long-term meditators, they had changes in about 2,500 gene expressions. When you meditate, when you change your attentional relationship to your body and to your surroundings, you change your epigenetic response. And we could talk all about that in the data about epigenetics and mothers who have babies and have happier babies. The Tibetans tell us that the most important thing about child rearing is when you're pregnant. Tibetan mothers spend their entire pregnancy praying for their child's well-being. And I listened to Danny Weinberger recently give a keynote talk on genetics and psychiatry, and what he said is they're discovering most importantly right now is that most of the influences in epigenetics and genetics that affect psychiatric illness occur during intrauterine life. By the time you're born, it's pretty much a done deal. Meditation helps. So that explains Linda Carlson's work. I'm sure Chuck Raisin showed this. This was a kind of funny study. They took a bunch of students and they trained them for 6 weeks in MBSR, and they had a control group, and they had this thing called the thematic stress, social stress test. Part of that is to give a talk, and they measured your inflammatory response and your cortisol and your POMS, your mood state while you're giving your talk. And what they expected was that people who meditated for 6 weeks would be less stressed, have less inflammation when they were giving their public talk, right? Public talking is supposed to be the most stressful thing any human being can do. Well, when they got the data, they were very disappointed, because actually what they found was the subjects who did the meditation actually had higher levels of stress and higher levels of inflammation. And so that was kind of disappointing. And they went back later and looked at the data, and what they discovered was actually there actually was a group that did extremely well. And this is, so we have 3 bars here. We have the control, we have the gray. The gray are people that didn't do their homework. They came to class and they said, this is what mindfulness is, and this is what you need to do for 1 hour a day, but they didn't do the homework. They just cheated. And the black box are the students who actually did the practice. And what they discovered was that if you actually did the practice, there were dramatic changes in your inflammatory response to being stressed out in social situations. Running out of time. I think I'm actually over time. Am I over time? Okay. So I'm going to leave you with just a couple of thoughts. The bottom line is it seems that the key areas that are involved in the brain and meditation changes are the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. Okay. Medical students learn much about the insular cortex. You do? I'm impressed. I knew absolutely nothing about the insular cortex, and I was a neuropsychiatrist. All right? It wasn't until the last couple of years the insular cortex even became considered to be of any importance at all. There are studies now coming out showing that, in fact, that the insular cortex is the key area in the modulation of our response to meditation practices. And I'm not going to go through this slide. More stuff on this. This is a study from or a paper from Bud Craig that I recommend on the insular cortex. What Bud Craig is suggesting is that the strange structure in our brain called the insular cortex actually is the structure in our brain that is responsible for modulating our relationship to things, both internal and external, and that includes time. And it seems to be the area of the brain that's affected by meditation. Isn't that interesting? He would also suggest, and I would refer you to his paper in Nature Neuroscience Reviews from, I think, March of last year, suggested that, in fact, even our perception of time can be changed if we do meditation and we have a different response in our relationship to the nature of time itself. And, of course, Stephen Hawking said this when he said time is a personal concept relative to the observer who measures it. So I'm going to finish with 2 slides now. So how am I going to put all of this together in just one easy package? Well, God, was, like Einstein said, God had a pretty simple plan. Everything else is details and very complicated. God made a very complicated looking brain, but actually he made it kind of simple because he said, let me divide it into 4 parts. We have into hemispheric sulcus, we have a central sulcus. Left anterior, right anterior, left posterior, right posterior. Just a coincidence? Well, no. The suggestion would be, in fact, that our brain is organized as a very simple operating system, and that when things are going well in our life, such as, I'm walking along here and things are going the way I expect it to be, I'm really activating my left prefrontal cortex based on the information that comes from my left posterior cortex, which has my software programs. It's like my library. So my software program says, Jim, it's okay if you take a walk in this direction. However, if I'm walking in this direction and suddenly I hear this rattling sound that could be an Arizona rattlesnake, what happens? Something's not computing, right? So I have to stop. And I have to go into an alertness mode, which activates my right posterior hemisphere, which is responsible for monitoring my external environment. Okay? I get information about the environment. Is that noise coming from a snake? Oh, it's one of the medical students who's just tapping his foot. That's okay. I feed that information forward into my right prefrontal cortex. I develop a new cognitive strategy, which is, it's okay, you can start walking again, but tell the medical student to stop tapping their foot. Okay? That's what happens, and life makes sense. What I would like to suggest is that the maintenance of harmony and restoration and resiliency essentially is a left hemispheric dominant experience that correlates with homeostasis and positive mood. That when we move into a state of alertness and problem solving, that anxious dysphoria that all of us dislike, we're living in a depleted catabolic state, which I used to see in my oncology patients, which equates to allostasis. Data demonstrates that the right hemisphere is dominant for sympathetic control, flight or fright response. The left hemisphere, interestingly, is dominant for parasympathetic control, and the vagus that I talked about. So when you live in that left hemisphere state of balance, harmony, things making sense, fitting, then you have an enhanced immune profile, positive mood state, and resiliency. What I would suggest is that meditation enhances parasympathetic tone. At the same time, it also makes sympathetic tone responsive as necessary in a flexible way based on seeing things as they really are, at relaxed attentiveness. And that this is mediated primarily through the insular cortex. And I'd like to finish off by suggesting that I think we need to move away from this preoccupation that we have with compassion to the concept of coherence. And this is a whole other talk in itself, but Indra's net tells us that everything is a reflection of everything else. As an acupuncturist, I know that I can place a tiny needle in exactly that part of my ear and that it will influence my lower left back, because everything is a hologram of everything else. And fractal theory is beginning to suggest exactly that everything is connected to everything else. And I think we need to develop a more coherent model of health and disease. So finally, what does this mean for healthcare in the future? Let's get serious about this. Allopathic medicine is what we do, but it has limited utility to disease-level pathology, not to homeostasis, allostasis. Mind training will produce more resilient human beings and a healthier world. Death is inevitable for all of us, but decay is not. That if we develop these models of healthcare and wellness and integrative approaches to wellness, people will live to be 120 and then they will die. They will not live to be 93 and have 65 years of misery getting there. Healing is founded on compassion and a deep experience of coherence. We need to develop systems that support homeostasis and resiliency. We need to move from a fear-based healthcare system to one that recognizes that happiness and coherence, as I showed you in that initial slide of the man going up to the mountain to see the guru and discovering that he was discovering his true self, that our true self is to be happy. We just have to be open to that and practice techniques that allow us to do that. And that the healing is the natural impulse of our universe if we stop blocking it with all our prejudices and all of our distortions. And that healing needs to be about our natural impulse to support each other, not just to make profit. Finishing with this. The Tibetan prophecy, one of my friends, is the dark times will be a time when human beings no longer have any space between their thoughts. That's an attentional problem. Think about the day that you're living. Think about the lives that we're creating for our children. Cell phones, going off, televisions. We need to move to a time where there's that space where transformation lives between the in-breath and the out-breath, 100 milliseconds between perception and conception. And we need to recognize, I think, that the next great technology is ready to be here. It was here all the time. It's called the technology of contemplative practices. And I'm not sure what other options we have because everything else is failing us. So I'm sorry I went over time. I covered a lot of stuff. I left out a lot of stuff. Be happy to send you some of the slides if you want them. Kali will send, if you leave her your email address, I can send you the slides. It'll be on iTunes. If you're having trouble sleeping one night, you can just watch it and it'll put you to sleep. Thank you very much.